Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. I'm going to get my slides pulled up. Tanya, I want to confirm that you can see that.
I can see it. Perfect. It is in good
Great.
shape. Yep.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much to Tanya and a little help for having me today. Like Tanya noted, my name is Kelly. I'm the Senior Director of Programs at the Alzheimer's Association of Colorado. We are a national organization that has chapters across the country. And so I work for the Colorado chapter. And in this role, I oversee our care and support services across Colorado. And that includes giving talks like this one. So today, my hope is to talk about three things. To first talk about some general information about Alzheimer's and dementia, um, possibly talk about the difference between those two terms, and talk about it on a population level. I also, secondly, will talk about some of the advancements that we're seeing due to the research and science as they relate to Alzheimer's diagnostics and treatment. Even if you were a dementia caregiver many years ago, today's landscape of medical care for Alzheimer's in particular looks entirely different. And there's a lot of advancements happening in this space. So I'll talk to some of those specifically around diagnostics and treatments. And then third, I'll talk about kind of the emotional experience of Alzheimer's and dementia, how it impacts caregivers and people with dementia, and what you all as neighbors, community members, family members can do to help. Each year, the Alzheimer's Association does a large scale kind of data review and analysis to put out the current statistics on Alzheimer's and dementia. Um, and to me, this justifies this conversation. Oftentimes, people will hear I work for the Alzheimer's Association and they'll say, oh, well, Alzheimer's is not in my family, so I'm good. I don't need to worry about that. I haven't had to worry about that yet. And certainly that experience is becoming more and more uncommon. We are seeing more and more people being personally affected by Alzheimer's. But in all reality, this is something that we should all care about, whether or not we have been personally impacted or whether or not we are currently caring for someone with Alzheimer's or currently living with dementia. The data shows that this is something that truly affects all of us in the United States, regardless of our personal story. We estimate that over 7 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's disease, and nearly 12 million are serving as their unpaid caregivers. So, what we say is this is a family system disease. Often, someone with Alzheimer's will lose the ability to recognize that they have Alzheimer's or dementia, but their family of choice, their family members, their friends around them become acutely aware as the disease progresses and are affected as caregivers by this disease, even if the person might not recognize they have it themselves. So, certainly, the caregiver experience is an important piece to this conversation. Alzheimer's is a tremendous economic issue for the United States. We estimate that in 2025 alone, Alzheimer's disease in actual costs costed the United States $384 billion. And if we were to value the care that the unpaid caregivers provided, because they're not paid, it's not an actual economic value, but if we were to value that care, we would estimate that they provide $413 billion of care each year. So this is a very costly disease to our nation. It's an economic issue as well as a health issue. We estimate that if nothing is done to change the trajectory of this disease, so to slow the disease, to modify its course, by 2050, these actual costs could rise above $1 trillion per year. So that is why, not only because of the emotional toll that it takes on the person and their caregivers, but also the financial toll that this disease places on our nation. That is why the United States and the Alzheimer's Association and many other organizations are working so hard to support people living with Alzheimer's and to come up with better things to help this community of people. Now, when we boil that down to Colorado, we estimate that there are 90,800 Coloradans living with Alzheimer's disease over age 65. So, age is the number one risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. As people get older, which we are all doing each and every day, we are all living longer each and every minute. Age is the number one risk factor. So as we are all aging, we are all increasing our risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. And so when we look at that over age 65 population, in Colorado, there are 90,800 Coloradans living with Alzheimer's, and that is Alzheimer's specifically due to the diagnostic data that this was pulled from. But it's important to note two things. First, when we look at the over age 65 population, we estimate that the prevalence is about 1 in 9 older adults has some form of dementia. So 1 in 9 over age 65. That number is 1 in 3 over age 85. So you can see that cases go up, prevalence goes up, it increases as age goes up, representing that age is the main risk factor. The second important thing to note is that people under age 65 can also develop Alzheimer's disease, and they are not accounted for in this number of 90,800. That is what we call younger onset Alzheimer's. It is when symptoms start to show up before someone is 65. And unfortunately, that disease can be challenging in its own way. It often can progress faster than later life Alzheimer's. And commonly, it takes place when people are possibly at the height of their career, when they are raising young families. And so that can pose its own challenges in and of itself. So it's important to note younger onset Alzheimer's exists as well. 177,000 Coloradans are serving as unpaid caregivers. And because Colorado's older adult population will double by 2050, which is just 25 years away, we're going to see a significantly larger group of people living with Alzheimer's and a significantly larger group of people serving as their unpaid caregivers. So we're certainly at this epicenter where we have larger groups of people. So we have more people because of the baby boomer population. We have larger groups of people growing older each and every day. So we have larger groups of people living longer. And thus, because age is the main risk factor for Alzheimer's, we are expecting a significantly higher prevalence of Alzheimer's disease. Now, on the screen here, I have some of the data around some of the workforce issues that we anticipate and the cost that Alzheimer's disease poses to Colorado. But due to time, I won't spend too much time going into that. But certainly when I send my slides out, you can review that information at your leisure. Next, I'll talk about terminology. The most common question we get is, what is the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia? In fact, up until this point, you may have noticed that I was even using the terms interchangeably. And so it's really important, especially as advancements and we have a better understanding of diagnostics and the advancements in this area are being made. It's very important to understand the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's. So let's start with dementia. Dementia is an umbrella term that is used to describe loss of memory and other thinking abilities. So think of things like changes in ability to plan and solve problems, changes in the ability to follow instructions, changes in mood and personality, losing the ability to retrace steps, changes in visual understanding and the ability to make sense of things. Dementia is the umbrella term that encapsulates all of those different things. Dementia represents cognitive impairment or cognitive changes that are severe enough and common enough, frequent enough to interfere with someone's daily life. So dementia are the symptoms. Dementia is an umbrella term that is used to describe the symptoms of cognitive impairment. But it is cognitive impairment when it is significant enough to interfere with daily life. Alzheimer's disease is a disease of the brain that is the most common cause of dementia. Alzheimer's disease, again, is a disease of the brain, so it is what's happening in the brain. Alzheimer's disease is the disease process in the brain represented in the buildup of amyloid plaques and tau tangles and other disease conditions. That is the most common cause of dementia. So when I work with families, I tell them dementia represents the things and the changes that you're noticing in your loved one. So possibly you're noticing that they're exhibiting memory loss. They're misplacing things, they're repeating themselves, they're asking the same question over and over again. And possibly they're also having some executive reasoning struggles. They're struggling to follow a recipe, they're struggling to knit or crochet like they always did. Those are dementia symptoms. Alzheimer's disease is actually what's happening in the brain. It's the pathological biological process in the brain, and it accounts to about 60 to 80% of all dementia. Other causes to dementia include vascular dementia, dementia with Lewy bodies, frontotemporal dementia, other conditions, and even mixed dementia when someone has dementia caused by two different things. My grandmother, for example, had vascular dementia. So she had a series and history of stroke and heart attack that affected the relationship between her heart and her brain. And due to that, some of her brain cells died, and thus she had vascular dementia. She experienced maybe memory loss and some personality changes from that vascular condition. Then she also developed the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease because Alzheimer's disease was also occurring in her brain. So she had what's called mixed dementia. I think that's why Alzheimer's and dementia are so commonly intertwined and used interchangeably, because Alzheimer's is the most common cause. We estimate that Alzheimer's causes about 60 to 80% of all dementia. Now, something that I hear people say quite often is they will say, well, my mom had dementia and then it became Alzheimer's. And that is an incorrect way of thinking about it. Though I would argue that that probably was the order in which it was diagnosed. It was so obvious that someone was having dementia, but it wasn't obvious until maybe the middle stage that the dementia was due to Alzheimer's. So they first were told, well, there's some dementia going on. And then it became quite clear that it was dementia due to Alzheimer's. But what should have happened is there should have been a conversation when those dementia symptoms first presented themselves to say, what could be causing these symptoms? What disease or condition could be causing things to happen? Because Alzheimer's disease would have been present in the brain at that time. In fact, we estimate, and as research has advanced and as diagnostics and scans have advanced, we estimate that 20 years before someone shows the symptoms of dementia, Alzheimer's disease starts to build up in the brain. Let me repeat that. So we estimate due to the research that has happened, that 20 years before someone has the symptoms of dementia, so 20 years before they're repeating themselves, getting lost, losing things, Alzheimer's disease, these plaques and tangles are present in the brain. This is very powerful for the future treatment of Alzheimer's because it gives the medical community a longer runway for possible treatment when it could be done at a time when someone is asymptomatic. We're not there yet, but this is a rapidly changing space when people are diagnosed sooner and sooner because of our greater understanding of Alzheimer's disease. So in short, Alzheimer's is a brain disease represented by amyloid plaques and tau tangles. So these are proteins that develop on the outside and inside of our neurons, our brain cells, that at first cause the neurons to maybe dysfunction a little bit. Like an example of that, it might be a little bit longer for someone to retrieve a word because those neurons just aren't firing as they once did. Over time, however, these amyloid plaques and tau tangles cause brain cell death, and we actually see brain cells start to die, and we see atrophy, shrinkage of the brain, to where someone loses function altogether. And while memory loss, short-term memory loss in particular, is one of the main symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, it can also include changes in thinking and behavior. As the disease progresses and grows throughout the brain, symptoms will become even more prevalent, and someone will need around-the-clock care due to the progression of the disease. So in the very earliest stages, the dementia is very mild. Someone might just forget what things are called, or they might get lost going to the grocery store, or they might just lose the ability to follow a recipe. And so their banana nut muffins kind of come out a little bit different than they used to. But as the disease progresses, because it's a progressive condition, symptoms become more significant. So we start to see things like paranoia, possibly thinking someone is stealing from them, like the mailman is stealing their mail, which could be happening because the person is getting their mail, they misplace it, they forgot that they got it. And so the next best thing that makes sense is to say, the mailman is stealing my mail. I can't find my mail. Or we see hallucinations, like seeing something is there that's not, actually hallucinating something. Or even delusions. So we start to see more significant behavioral challenges. We even see the loss of long-term memory, and people may start to forget people who they should know closely or have known a long time, like dear family members. And this is what can be so painful to care partners. And someone eventually will need around-the-clock 24/7 care because they need supervision to remain safe. They need help with even the most basic activities. And so this is why this is also a condition of the caregiver. Now, one of the most frustrating things with Alzheimer's disease is it's hard to say how long, how many years, what's the number of years it takes for this disease to progress. It varies widely. It can depend on a number of different things. It can depend on when someone is diagnosed, right? Someone could be undiagnosed for a number of years. And so their timeline with the disease may appear shorter because they got diagnosed maybe in that middle stage. But it also can depend on their overall health. Someone can be very healthy otherwise and live with Alzheimer's for many years. And it also depends on their quality of care. So someone receiving a lot of great care, a lot of good socialization, possibly they implemented a lot of lifestyle changes early on in the disease. Someone can live a number of years with this disease. And that can be what's so challenging is families want to know what to expect. They want to know, when will this happen, or when could this happen? And it's very hard to say with Alzheimer's. And that's what makes it so challenging for the caregiver. But it's important to just know that even though we can't anticipate the timeline, we know that it is a progressive condition. Now, I talked about the fact that we are in this kind of rapidly changing landscape of improved diagnostics. So what do I mean by that? What does that mean? In the past, Alzheimer's disease, when it was causing dementia, that dementia was often not detected until it was maybe even in the middle stages. The changes in someone's cognition were so severe, so pronounced, that it was quite obvious what was going on. But family members might look back and think, oh, well, I remember this happening, and possibly that was kind of one of those early signs. So with my grandmother, for example, one of the things I remember noticing was she started to struggle making coffee. And so what she did, because running the coffee machine was too difficult, was she would just try to dissolve her coffee grounds in water as if it was instant coffee, even though it wasn't. At the time, I think we just brushed it off as laziness, or, well, that's kind of strange. She just must have gotten fed up with their coffee maker. But in hindsight, when her dementia became so progressed, it was quite obvious that was one of those early signs that we should have picked up on to say, oh, well, that was probably an early sign of her loss of ability to do basic processes. So due to our general awareness of dementia and due to improved diagnostic tools that I'll talk about in a minute, we are seeing earlier and earlier diagnoses. So we're advocating that people receive a diagnosis and talk to their doctor about their brain health and their cognition as early as possible. So it's important for all of us to pay attention to our memory, thinking, and behavior, and to detect any possible changes that could be concerning. And we're really advocating that people start to talk to their doctor if they have dementia symptoms, or even if they are cognitively healthy, about their brain and cognitive health, and to do an annual cognitive screening so that any subtle changes can be detected sooner than later. So this is certainly a condition where that early detection, that early diagnosis is really important. So if and when someone is concerned about their memory or thinking, or I would say even if they're over age 65, they should start by talking to their general physician, their family physician at their annual wellness visit to do a cognitive assessment. So that is true if someone is exhibiting changes or even if they're just older. Both of those groups of people should talk to their doctor about their cognitive health for those routine screenings. Because those routine screenings can catch subtle changes in cognition that then should prompt a physician to say, well, what's going on? What could be causing that cognitive impairment? Dementia is no longer a good diagnosis. Dementia means something is going on, but there should be further testing to see what's going on. Some things like poorly treated sleep apnea, mismanaged diabetes, vitamin deficiency, some things like that are actually treatable can cause someone to have cognitive impairment. So cognitive impairment or dementia should be rationale for further testing because there are some things that are otherwise treatable that could help someone's cognition. Or someone may need to go down further testing to determine if Alzheimer's disease, for example, is the cause. And when someone is diagnosed early, in that early stage, or even earlier in the mild cognitive impairment stage, it allows the patient to participate in their decisions, which is so important, to plan for a future, to explore treatment options. There are so many new treatments, even just in the last 6 months, that have shown to have benefit for people with Alzheimer's. It allows them to participate in clinical studies, and it allows them to participate in important decisions on behalf of themselves And most importantly, which isn't noted on this slide, it allows them to get all those things out of the way and possibly check off some really important bucket list items. In the last 3 or 4 years, we have seen the development of new treatments for Alzheimer's disease. Now, for years, 20 plus 30 years even, drugs like Aricept and Namenda have been on the market, and there have been pharmacological treatments for Alzheimer's disease. These drugs did not and do not, they still are in use, they do not address the disease. The disease, those amyloid plaques, those tau tangles, is still progressing. They just help manage some of the symptoms, but they were really hard to test to see if someone actually was improving on them. In the past handful of years, just 2 or 3 years, the FDA has approved 2 new therapies, lecanemab and donanemab, that are actually disease-modifying therapies. They are proven to remove those amyloid plaques in the brain, and thus people are able to cognitively function better and longer on them. So we are in this kind of day and age, just in the last few years, where there are actual treatments for Alzheimer's disease, rather than just treatments for some of the symptoms. We actually have disease-modifying treatments. And in clinical trials and clinical studies, there are hundreds of other therapies that address other components of the disease being tested. And so, like I said, these are being approved and moving through the pipeline rather quickly. So this is a rapidly changing time in kind of the Alzheimer's space. Concurrent to that are advancements in diagnostics. So I mentioned a basic cognitive assessment. A cognitive assessment detects maybe basic impairment. It doesn't necessarily look at what's happening in the body that could be causing those things. A PET scan, PET, has been used for a number of years now to detect Alzheimer's disease in the brain, to therefore qualify someone for these new treatments. Now, in maybe the past 6 months, you may have read in the news that the FDA approved a blood test. And this blood test, which is much easier than a PET scan, right? Much easier to deliver at scale, that looks to detect amyloid plaques in the brain and is now starting to be used after someone shows symptoms in that diagnostic process. So in short, there's no cure for Alzheimer's. However, there are treatments now within the last couple of years that can change the disease progression. So it can actually slow the progression of the disease so that someone can maintain their cognitive ability or even improve for longer. Additionally, there's been research that shows that things like physical exercise, eating a good diet, and getting enough social and cognitive activity are good for the brain. So that's what it means by non-drug options that can help treat some of those symptoms. So these new treatments are available, and they are the first to slow the progression of the disease. But everyone experiences Alzheimer's differently, and so we're still creating an evidence base to show that these kind of work in varying disease degrees and aren't necessarily appropriate for all dementias, for example. These have been tested on people with the specific pathological and biological disease of Alzheimer's. Now I'm going to transition briefly into talking about kind of some of the emotional aspects that as family members, neighbors, etc., we should be aware of as we are more and more likely to encounter someone with any dementia, but particularly Alzheimer's. So even though it's very exciting that we have these new medical interventions for someone with Alzheimer's, it's important to also note that this can be a very challenging disease to process psychologically and emotionally. Someone after a diagnosis might feel anger, right? Their life might be taken in an entirely different direction that they had planned. I've known people who thought, okay, we're going to retire. We sold the house, we bought an RV, and we're going to drive around the country. And bam, one of the spouses gets diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And so it kind of changes their course of what they thought life was going to be. There's a lot of anger in that. Sometimes people might have relief. They might feel a sigh of relief that they're forgetting people's names at their bowling league, not because they don't care about those people, but because of the disease itself. So some people feel a sense of relief as there's a reason for these things happening. Depression is very common. And in fact, many people who are treated in the early stages of Alzheimer's are often treated for depression because that is a natural occurrence along with fear to happen in these early stages. Someone might feel a great sense of isolation. I've seen it happen a variety of different ways. Sometimes people might not want to tell anyone that they have Alzheimer's, and so that is what isolates them. They retreat from things they once enjoyed because they don't want to tell people. I've also seen it happen where people tell everyone that they have Alzheimer's, but then their friends and family, etc., stop coming around because they just don't know how to interact. And that can cause their isolation. So isolation is very real to this. And then there's kind of this ambiguous sense of loss, a sense of grief that maybe someone loved to ride motorcycles, and now because of this, it's no longer safe. And so they've lost that ability. And so there is a sense of loss in this as well. So it's very important for someone with dementia to not only treat kind of the medical component of the disease, but also the emotional component. And so some thoughts that I have here as kind of ways to overcome or manage some of these changes is to start journaling. I've known a number of people in their early stages of Alzheimer's to start writing a book of their own experience, of their life. Journaling can be very powerful. To disclose their diagnosis, tell people, form that social support network. And if people don't want to be a part of it, find people who do. So surrounding yourself with support is really important. The Alzheimer's Association has a few different platforms. We have a message board for people with dementia to hop online and connect through All's Connected. And then we also have a support group, a variety of support groups for people in that early stage of dementia to get with people going through that experience with them and talk about what it means to them. Stay engaged. It might need some modification, but stay active in things someone once enjoyed doing. But take time to feel those emotions because this is a very emotional disease as well. We know that this has a significant impact on families and families of choice. We know that caring for someone with Alzheimer's throughout the progression of the disease not only affects the person with it, but their family system in a physical, emotional, social, and financial way. In fact, when we compare caregivers of people with other conditions to dementia caregivers, twice as many caregivers of those with dementia indicate substantial emotional, financial, and physical difficulties. So that's not to say that caring for someone with another condition isn't challenging. It certainly is. It's to note that dementia caregiving certainly comes with its own additional challenges. And while there's a number of amazing professionals who provide care, might be home caregivers or facility-based, assisted living-based, for example, caregivers, a large majority, almost 70% of all care to someone with dementia is actually delivered by unpaid caregivers. So family members, friends, etc. We know that dementia is very expensive. It causes people to have to step out of the workforce more often. It causes them to have to hire professional care at higher rates. And so they experience twice the average out-of-pocket caregiving expenses as well. They have higher rates of depression and anxiety. And interestingly, we see that women carry the burden of dementia caregiving. And I think when people assume a dementia caregiver, they think of someone maybe older caring for a spouse. But what's interesting to me is that two-thirds of caregivers are actually under age 65. Most of them are still in the workforce. And this is particularly true with women who might be in the workforce and raising young families. We're starting to see a lot of those sandwich generation caregivers. Now, what does caregiver stress look like? So I always like to talk about some of the signs of caregiver stress. Denial about the disease. This could look like, oh, he's fine. He just didn't sleep well. That's why that's happening, right? We're in denial of what's happening. We're blaming it on something else. New levels of anger and irritability. The caregiver themselves withdrawing from things they once enjoyed, either because of the emotional toll or logistical toll. They just no longer can leave their loved one to go to their sewing circle. We see anxiety and depression, sleeplessness or exhaustion, issues with concentration, and other health problems. A figure that has been cited for many years is that statistically, dementia caregivers are often unhealthier than the person with dementia. And that is because of all of these challenges compounding and caregivers not taking care of themselves. So it's incredibly important for caregivers to continue to see their doctor, continue to take care of their own physical health, plug into one of our caregiver support groups, and receive the support that they need. I mentioned that we at the Alzheimer's Association have tremendous support. We have a 24/7 helpline. The phone number is here. So someone can literally call this day or night, 365 days a year, and talk to a master's level dementia expert to just cry, receive emotional support, or even receive maybe some coaching strategies. Possibly someone is exhibiting strange behaviors, they're hallucinating, and the caregiver just doesn't know what to do, so they want some coaching around that. It's very important for caregivers to take care of themselves, eat well, exercise, get plenty of rest. I think the best use of respite care or a caregiver coming over is for a caregiver to take a nap. I've also seen caregivers use respite care to get back to golf. And so it's important for caregivers to take a break of themselves for themselves, because they will be better caregivers in the long run. Now, possibly you've come today and you don't have a family member who's been affected by Alzheimer's and you're not a caregiver, but possibly you have a close neighbor who you're very close with who is exhibiting signs and you want to know how to support. So I'm gonna end today with just 10 ways to help a family or a person facing dementia. I think the mission of A Little Help, our neighbors helping neighbors. And so I think that this fits that message. Educate yourself. The more you learn about Alzheimer's disease, the easier it is to understand why something is happening and how to respond. Stay in touch. This is so important. I've heard even adult children say, I'm not going to go visit dad anymore at his care home because he can't carry on a conversation and he no longer asks about my day. And so find new ways to stay in touch. It might be visiting and just listening to a song, or if you live afar, sending a postcard that possibly they can get joy out of the image. Patience goes a long way with dementia. Offer a shoulder to lean on, just be there for all of the family members in different ways and recognize that it affects people in different ways. Always include the person with dementia. Never assume that the person with dementia can't understand, can't hear, or can't do something. They should still be a part of a conversation, and we should never talk about them as if they're not there. Help the family tackle a to-do list. The best example of this is I once had a caregiver ask her family for casseroles to put in her freezer for Christmas. What a simple way to make life so much easier over the next 6 months. So people can help with the most simplest of things. I always say, rather than asking how to help, just tell them how you're going to help. Even if it's as simple as, you know what, I'm going to go buy a frozen lasagna and stick it in your freezer. It'll come in handy. Continue to invite people and offer a reprieve. Be flexible and just stay involved and get involved in the Alzheimer's and dementia space, because the statistics that I started with today certainly justify that as a population level, even if it hasn't affected us personally, it is certainly affecting our communities, our neighborhoods, our population. And so it's something we should all learn about. And I'm going to end with I think we've all heard that Maya Angelou quote that someone may never remember what you say, but they will always remember how you feel. So I like these notes. It's actually from one of our pieces of literature that's available online at the Alzheimer's Association of how does someone with dementia want to feel? They want to feel like they're the same person they were before their diagnosis. They want independence and to be able to do things even if they might need some help. It's essential that they stay engaged and that they're continuing to be invited to things that they once enjoyed. They don't want people to make assumptions about them. Alzheimer's affects each person differently. And that is certainly true with some of the other dementias. There's dementia that doesn't affect memory at all. So someone can be very quick with short-term memory, but maybe their language is affected differently. So don't make assumptions. Continuing to ask them how they're doing. Just because someone has Alzheimer's doesn't mean they can't be a person. They want to engage in conversation and connection, even if that looks differently, like listening to a song instead of having a full conversation. And don't pull away. Try not to contribute to the isolation that happens when people have dementia. So I'm going to end there. There are some tips of things that we can all do to take care of our brain, but I don't want to go into those too much. But I do want to just formally conclude by noting how great our helpline is. And through a helpline, you can find education programs in your area and support groups. So Tanya, I didn't see any questions along the way,
Yeah, but
but
I'm not
certainly if
seeing, yeah, I'm not seeing any hands raised. Does anybody have anything
all
that
right.
they'd like to address? I thought that was amazing, Kelly.
Oh, good. No, my
So,
pleasure.
yeah, just such good information. I see Jackie did, so I'm gonna click the allow to talk here. Jackie, if you want to unmute yourself, you can and ask Kelly a question. Is it working, Jackie? Can you unmute yourself?
I think she's just got to find her.
Yeah, find the,
There
there
she
we
goes.
go.
Okay, I wanted to know what age, the earliest age, someone with dementia. Can it start as early as in your late 50s or early 60s?
Oh, certainly. So the question was, um, talk about age. So when we talk about Alzheimer's being the cause of dementia, kind of typical onset is
Hmm.
when symptoms, so memory loss, those symptoms occur after age 65. Younger onset Alzheimer's can happen as early as someone's 20s, 30s, 40s. It's not very common. It's very rare that that happens. And often when people have that young of Alzheimer's, it's due to a genetic factor that is very, very rare. But certainly Alzheimer's can affect people as early as 20s, 30s, 40s. It's just not very common. Now, the other causes of dementia, frontotemporal dementia, for example, affects younger men mostly. That's what Bruce Willis has. Um, and then there are causes like CTE, which is due to chronic head injury and concussion that affects people much earlier as well. But when we talk about Alzheimer's, younger onset is when it is under age 65, and it can present itself as early as 20s, 30s, and 40s, but likely that's a very, very rare cause due to a gene.
Okay. Also, I would like to know if your mother or father was diagnosed with it as a possibility it can be passed down to the child.
Yeah, great question, Jackie. So we say that, so the question was um, about family history. So family history is different than genetics. So genetics are, that's our specific genetic mapping, right? Family history is just prevalence, the occurrence of the disease in our family tree. The number one risk factor is age. So even if someone does not have any family history of Alzheimer's, as they grow older, they are still at risk. So family history, so having a parent or sibling does increase someone's risk. But it's important to note that while that's true, so me, Kelly, I have family history, so that increases my risk. People without any family history at all are still at risk and are at higher risk if they have things like history of brain injury, cardiovascular markers like diabetes or high cholesterol. So it doesn't, it that's to say that if you never have had Alzheimer's in your family, that doesn't mean that someone's in the clear, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
Kelly, it kind of goes back to when Jackie was asking about the age. Early on, you mentioned how it's kind of like 20 years ahead of time. That's was very interesting to me. Can you go, what do you mean by that? I guess, can you go back to that a little bit?
Yeah, so that will change how this disease is diagnosed in the near future. So what that means is the scientific community has found biomarkers with Alzheimer's disease. What biomarkers are they are things in our blood or otherwise that show presence of disease. So all of us are very accustomed, we're very used to getting our blood drawn to check our cholesterol numbers. That blood draw detects biomarkers for heart disease. So high cholesterol is used as a biomarker, often in an asymptomatic, so there's no symptoms of heart disease, to detect heart disease earlier. With Alzheimer's disease, we have known for decades that Alzheimer's disease is due to these amyloid plaques and tau tangles on the brain. Historically, someone had to be dead. Their brain would have had to have been looked at after death to see those plaques and tangles. Due to the advancements in PET scans. So PET scans are not new technology, but the FDA recently has approved certain dyes that when they are used with a PET scan can show in those scans that someone has elevated levels of amyloid and tau in their brain. The second is that blood test. So through a simple blood draw, it can show, again, elevated levels of amyloid and tau. So right now, just in clinical trials, so this isn't necessarily in the everyday medical community practice, in clinical trials, they have found, due to years of research, that there was presence of disease, possibly through PET scans or these blood specimens, up to 20 years before that person started showing dementia symptoms.
So
So
could
what
you, oh,
what
sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I think I cut you off.
Oh, I was just going to ask, so does
So
that
what that
mean
will
like
mean,
you could get a blood draw and ask them to check your amyloids?
you could, but that is not the medical recommendation at this
Oh,
time. So it might soon be, but that is at this time, there's not enough evidence to apply this to the general population yet. But that's what they're looking for is in future years, how early should these tests be used? Because at some point, it's hard to say when, but at some point there will be a time where the medical community could intervene before someone has dementia
Mhm.
symptoms. So it's very future looking, but just in the next, 5, 10 years.
Good, good.
It's
Um,
interesting, but
yes, yeah.
it doesn't mean right now we all should go out and do this because the evidence isn't quite there yet. The clinical studies are still ongoing.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions? Anything else?